Alright, let's learn some shit. G'day friends, today we're talking about focusing. How to get that perfectly sharp focused image. Have you ever gotten back and put the files on the computer and they're just a little fuzzy? They're just not that sharp? Dude, it sucks. So in today's video, I'm going to share my little sharpest checklist, the things I run through in my head when I'm out shooting that will either help prevent this or diagnose those sharpness issues you might have. First thing, obviously the first thing is nailing the focus. Now there's usually two different kind of modes your camera will be on, one shot or servo. One shot is for landscapes, static frames, things that will lock your focus to a certain point. You'll hit that little beep, see a little red box. That's to tell you that it's selected the focus and won't change until you refocus the camera. Whereas servo will track the subject and change the focus as it continues to move in and out as you continue to shoot images. You'll see that little blue box, see the subject following, maybe like a little flashing. One thing to note though, when shooting through elements in the foreground, like this shot of a bear for instance, I was livid when I realized that actually been focusing on the grass that was this far in front of its face instead of the bear's face, and it's just out of focus and completely useless. Then there's also another technique where I want to get everything in the foreground and the background perfectly sharp, and this is called focus stacking. It's more of an advanced technique, but I'll give you a little rundown at the end and dive into more about what focus stacking is if you're interested. The importance of light in sharpness. Now, light makes a huge difference in creating sharper photos. Both the quantity and the quality of the light directly impact the image sharpness. Sharpness often depends on the micro contrast between the brighter elements of the photo and those adjacent shadows. Directional light, such as early morning light or late afternoon sunlight, creates this contrast. It'll enhance the details in rocks, foliage, mountain peaks, skin, hair, any kind of texture. For example, compare these two photos. One was taken on an overcast day where the light was diffused, kind of flat, whereas the other one was created on a crisp morning with directional light, and it really highlights the details in that elk. Poor lighting doesn't just affect the micro contrasts in your images, it also forces you to use higher ISO settings, which will then introduce noise into your image. Alright, so ISO and image quality. High ISO can affect the image sharpness in several ways. That's primarily due to the impact of the quality of the actual file. Here's how it happens. Increased noise reduces perceived sharpness. At higher ISO settings, the camera's sensor amplifies the light to compensate for those low light conditions. That amplification introduces that digital noise. That's that grain or like little specks of color that will actually take away from the details. The other thing when it comes to using a higher ISO is the in-camera noise reduction and post-processing noise reduction. But the in-camera noise reduction is often applied to reduce that noise, to reduce that grain and those digital colors, but it does blur the edges in that process. So an over-aggressive noise reduction will actually make your entire image look soft and lack that texture, that contrast between the dark and the lights. So the next thing to think about when going through your checklist is your shutter speed. Now, freezing motion and avoiding camera shake is absolutely key when it comes to creating sharp images. Shutter speed is the time your sensor is exposed to light. That's the time the shutter is open, actually exposing the image. So for fast moving subjects, you want to make sure that the shutter is fast enough to freeze that motion. While landscapes are usually static, elements like flowing water, windblown foliage will require a fast enough shutter to capture them crisply. Then there's elements like moving cars or wildlife or even people moving suddenly. It might not create like a complete motion blur, but it might just add that little bit of softness if your shutter speed is just too low. A lot of the cameras these days will kind of lull you into a false sense of security because the image stabilization is so good now that you can handheld really long shutters that you usually couldn't do before. And a lot of the time people will be like, oh no, everything's sharp, but why is my subject blurry? That's why, because it doesn't change the fact that your camera might be able to keep everything level, but whatever's actually in the frame still has movement. For longer exposures, especially when shooting landscape photography, using a tripod is also an essential thing for stability. Be sure that everything's tight though, because the slightest movement will throw off the sharpness of the image. I did one the other night out on a glacier, and one of the legs was just a little bit loose, and it just slowly went down. The entire shoot was kind of pointless. Everything was blurry. All right, next thing is aperture. And every lens has just like this sweet spot. Now, this one I didn't know for the longest time. Every lens has an aperture where it performs the best, and it's often a stop or two narrower than its wider setting. For example, if you've got an f4 lens, it might be sharpest at 5.6 or f8. You can test this by shooting in your house on a textured surface, maybe put a map up or a piece of paper with some writing on it, and shoot the whole way through the aperture range and just pick out which one is perfectly sharp. Now, it's a tiny effect most of the time, but when you really get to know your gear, you can squeeze the best out of your equipment, no matter what it is. Now, it's not going to do much for shots for Instagram, but when someone asks to buy one of those shots and blow it up the size of a wall, and you've got the opportunity to make thousands of dollars, you're going to be stoked that you absolutely nailed the focus on that shot. Another thing to think about when you're adjusting the aperture is the depth of field. So if you're shooting at an aperture of, say, 2.8 or lower, be careful of the actual depth of field. Now, the depth of field is the amount of the image that's actually in focus. So you can see behind me, everything behind me is out of focus. That is essentially depth of field. Like, it's focusing on my face, on my eyes right now, and then the background is obviously blurred out. For example, when shooting portraits and shooting really up close, like right in their face, if you're shooting at like 1.8 or something lower than that, your eyes might actually be a different focal length to your nose. So one of those will be out of focus. It's something to think about when shooting portraits or anything really close up. All right. Stabilization technique. When you're out in the wild, you might not always have the luxury of like perfect conditions or gear. And that's why proper technique is key. So here's how I stabilize for sharpest shots, especially in some challenging environments. When you're shooting, tuck your elbows nice and close to your body and hold the lens firmly. Either like that with a bigger than a little 50mm prime, and then also press it to your face, because when you're holding a camera out like this, it gets a lot more wobble, a lot easier, whereas when it's locked into your body and up to your face, the camera's going to be much more stable. Now the next thing would be panning and tracking. So say if you've got a subject and it's moving along the frame, you're going to want to focus and pan along with it, but I wouldn't hold it out and pan like this. I would keep that locked and use your entire upper body or your swivel chair like I'm using right now. But you can literally use your entire upper body to keep that motion fluid. So for focus and sharpness, those are the main things that I go through every single time I'm out shooting. It's just my little mental checklist. By following all these tips, you'll absolutely get sharper photos no matter where your adventures take you. And you can just focus on doing a job or telling the story that you're trying to tell, and not actually worry about, am I getting this right? Once it's ingrained in your head, you won't even notice you're doing it. But one last thing, that focus stacking that I mentioned, it's more of an advanced landscape photography technique, but once you learn this process, it will absolutely change the game for you. If you're going to want to set up your camera on a tripod and then take multiple images, starting right at the background and going all the way through the focal range to things right up close in the foreground. Now, after that, you're going to take those images and seamlessly blend them together in Photoshop. It is super important that you shoot this entirely in manual, including the white balance, because if the colors change, it kind of throws your image off a little bit. If you want to learn more about that, I've got a full tutorial that I'll link below, and that runs you through the entire process, including how to do it in Photoshop. It's an absolute game changer. Like, I almost everything I shoot when it's a landscape shot, I'm doing that. If you found this video helpful, give it a like, let me know in the comments what other things in photography you might need help on, or anything you want to learn. But for now, grab your camera, get out there, and go capture something amazing. Go have some fun. I'll see you guys next week. Peace.